A video posted by a hunting crew called Python Cowboy Hunts shows something most people have never seen and probably never wanted to. A tangle of Burmese pythons wound together in what biologists call a mating ball, deep in the swamps of the Florida Everglades. The footage shows two males locked around each other, with crews working to physically untangle the knot, all while one of the hunters says into the camera that there's likely a much bigger female nearby because when these snakes gather to breed, two is rarely the whole story. That single clip, shared just a few weeks ago, has reignited attention on a crisis that's been quietly reshaping one of America's most important ecosystems for decades. And the footage capturing it lately tells a story far stranger than most people realize. Let's start with the basics, because the scale of this problem is genuinely hard to grasp until you see the numbers laid out. Burmese pythons aren't native to Florida. Their natural range covers India, southern China, the Malay Peninsula, and parts of the East Indies. Researchers believe they got their foothold in the Everglades through the exotic pet trade. Owners who could no longer handle a snake that started at 2 feet and eventually grew into a creature 20 feet long simply released them into the swamp instead of dealing with the problem responsibly. What started as scattered, isolated releases sometime in the late 20th century has since exploded into an established breeding population stretching from just south of Lake Okeechobee all the way to Key Largo, and from western Broward County west into Collier County, according to drone technology companies now working alongside hunters in the field. Current estimates put the population at over 100,000 pythons infesting the Everglades, and that number could be conservative, since these snakes are notoriously difficult to detect in dense, swampy terrain. The damage these snakes have done to native wildlife is the real story behind the headline, and it's almost hard to believe until you see the actual research. A widely cited study tracking Everglades mammal populations between 1997 and 2012 found that raccoon populations had dropped by 99.3%, opossums fell by 98.9%, bobcats dropped by 87.5%, marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes didn't just decline. Researchers said they effectively disappeared from large stretches of the python's range entirely. More recent assessments put overall small wildlife losses at around 90% across the snake's core territory. White-tailed deer, once common throughout the region, have also been hit hard. These aren't numbers from a fringe study. This is the scientific consensus on what happens when an apex predator with no natural enemies and an enormous appetite gets dropped into an ecosystem that spent millions of years evolving without it. And these snakes don't just eat small mammals. Burmese pythons are powerful enough to strangle, kill, and swallow full-grown alligators. A predator that, under any other circumstances, would be sitting comfortably at the top of the Everglades food chain. They've also been documented consuming threatened and federally protected species, including the wood stork and the Key Largo wood rat, both of which were already struggling before pythons entered the picture. When a single species can take down an alligator and also wipe out an endangered rodent population, you're not looking at a normal predator-prey relationship. You're looking at an invasive species operating with almost no natural checks on its growth. This is where the recent footage becomes genuinely important, not just dramatic. In May of this year, veteran snake hunter Kevin Pavlidis, known online as Snakeaholic, uncovered 2 neighboring python nests in a single outing, containing roughly 120 eggs combined. That number alone is staggering when you consider what it represents: not snakes that already exist and are already doing damage, but the next generation, incubating quietly underground, ready to hatch into a swamp that's already overrun. Hunters who specialize in this work have been blunt about what discoveries like this actually mean. Earlier this year, hunter Carl Jackson captured the second heaviest Burmese python never recorded in Florida history. 16 feet, 10 inches long, weighing 202 pounds, and carrying a full clutch of eggs inside her body. Jackson, who moved to Florida specifically to become a python hunter after watching professionals on television, said the egg clutch mattered to him more than the size record. In his own words, removing that one snake eliminated roughly 200 potential deer and native animal eaters before they ever had the chance to hatch. The mating ball footage that's been circulating recently fits into this same pattern, and it's worth understanding why wildlife officials take these clusters so seriously. When multiple male pythons converge around a single breeding female, it signals that the population isn't just surviving in the Everglades, it's actively successfully reproducing at scale, season after season, largely unchecked. Crews who encounter these clusters know that capturing the visible males is only part of the job. The real prize and the real threat is the much larger breeding female nearby, because she alone could be responsible for laying dozens of eggs in a single season. Wildlife managers have specifically engineered a technique around this vulnerability, using radio-tagged male pythons, nicknamed Judas snakes, that are released back into the wild specifically because pythons are drawn instinctively toward breeding females during mating season. Biologists then track the radio signal, follow the Judas snake straight to a much larger, much more reproductively significant female, and remove her from the ecosystem before she can lay another clutch. The logic behind that approach is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it reflects just how difficult this species is to fight. Using conventional methods, a single Judas snake released back into a swamp spanning roughly 1.5 million acres can end up leading researchers to multiple separate breeding females over the course of a single mating season, each one capable of producing dozens of offspring on its own. Without that kind of targeted tracking, finding a single python hidden in dense sawgrass and standing water is, by most hunters' own accounts, closer to luck than skill. With it, removal programs have started to shift from a purely reactive model, responding to sightings reported by the public towards something closer to a proactive hunting strategy, deliberately seeking out the snakes responsible for the largest share of future population growth rather than just the ones easiest to spot. The hunting effort itself has evolved into something far more sophisticated than people typically imagine when they picture someone wading through a swamp with a flashlight. It's also worth understanding just how physically demanding and genuinely dangerous this work is, because the footage tends to make it look more controlled than it actually is in the moment. When Carl Jackson captured that 16-foot, 10-inch python earlier this year, the snake managed to coil around his body several times during the struggle, and he was dragged across an anthill in the process before his family, who happened to have become certified assistants with the state's Python Action Team just one day earlier, were able to help uncoil the animal and secure it safely. That's not a rare or exaggerated detail. Pythons of that size are powerful enough to constrict serious injury into a grown adult within seconds if a capture goes wrong. Which is exactly why the state requires hunters working through official programs to go through certification before they're allowed into the field. Despite the risk, Jackson and his family didn't stop there. Later the same day, they returned to the same general area and captured a second python, a 10-foot male, turning what started as a single record-breaking encounter into a two-snake outing within hours. Florida wildlife agencies have rolled out licensed removal contractors, organized public competitions like the Florida Python Challenge, and partnered with technology companies experimenting with thermal imaging drones specifically built to spot pythons at night, which happens to be their prime hunting period. Footage released by one of these drone companies, working alongside a hunter known as Florida's top python tracker, showed thermal imaging clearly picking up the heat signature of a massive python from the air, even in total darkness. According to the company behind the technology, the same thermal cameras proved sensitive enough to detect native snakes as small as 18 inches, which means the same tool could eventually help hunters locate clusters of newly hatched python hatchlings before they have the chance to scatter and grow into the next generation of 20. Foot predators. That detail matters enormously, because adult pythons are notoriously difficult to find in dense vegetation, but catching them early, at the hatchling stage, is one of the only realistic ways to meaningfully slow down the reproductive cycle driving this entire crisis. Burmese pythons were formally added to Florida's prohibited species list back in 2021, making it illegal to keep them as pets within the state. And they're separately classified as an injurious species under the Federal Lacey Act, which bars importing them into the country altogether. Those legal protections exist precisely because of what's already happened in the Everglades, an attempt to prevent the next invasive reptile crisis before it starts somewhere else. But as conservationists, are quick to point out legislation addressing future releases does almost nothing to solve the population that's already firmly established and actively breeding right now. The discovery of two python nests sitting side by side in a single outing, found by one hunter on one ordinary day, is exactly the kind of detail that underscores how far behind containment efforts still are, even after years of organized removal programs. It's worth being clear about what this crisis actually threatens, because the consequences extend well beyond a single swamp ecosystem most people will never personally visit. The Everglades isn't simply a wildlife refuge sitting quietly in the background of South Florida. It's a functioning, working system that filters fresh water for millions of people, buffers the region against hurricanes and storm surge, and directly supports the tourism, fishing, and broader economy of South Florida. When an apex predator spreads unchecked through a system like that, wiping out the small and medium mammal populations that the rest of the food web depends on, the consequences ripple outward in ways that aren't always immediately visible but are nonetheless real: degraded water quality, weakened storm protection, and a steadily eroding natural buffer that the region has relied on for generations. So what actually changed, and why does the recent footage feel like it's revealing an aftermath nobody quite expected? For years, the python crisis was something most Floridians understood abstractly: a strange, headline-grabbing problem confined to deep, inaccessible swampland that most people would never personally encounter. The footage emerging over just the past few months tells a different story. It's not abstract anymore, it's a tangled mass of breeding males caught on camera mid-mating ritual. It's a hunter being dragged over an anthill while wrestling a 200-pound snake carrying dozens of unborn eggs. It's thermal drones picking up the unmistakable heat signature of something enormous moving through total darkness. It's two nests, side by side, found in a single afternoon, representing 120 more snakes that nearly made it into the world undetected individually. Each of these moments looks like an isolated, almost novelty wildlife story. Strung together across just the last few months, they paint a much clearer picture: an invasive species that isn't just persisting in the Everglades, it's thriving, reproducing aggressively, and continuing to expand its range, even after years of dedicated, increasingly high-tech removal efforts. The people closest to this problem aren't pretending the fight is anywhere close to over. Wildlife officials and researchers consistently describe prevention as the single most powerful tool still available, alongside removal, never releasing exotic pets into the wild, participating in official pet surrender programs designed specifically to give owners an alternative to releasing animals into nature, and reporting python sightings directly to wildlife officials the moment they happen. None of those measures undo the population that's already established itself across well over 1 million acres of South Florida wetland, but every official working this crisis agrees on one point without much disagreement: left unchecked, with breeding pairs forming in the open and egg clutches numbering in the hundreds being discovered. In single outings, this is a problem that will only continue deepening. There's also a longer historical lesson buried inside this story that's easy to miss in the middle of all the dramatic footage. Florida has dealt with invasive species before, and not all of those fights ended the same way. Some invasive plants and smaller animals have been successfully contained or even eradicated through aggressive early intervention, while species that were allowed to establish themselves over decades, the way pythons were, have proven far harder to dislodge once they ray fully woven into the ecosystem. That's part of why wildlife officials keep emphasizing prevention as urgently as removal, not because removal doesn't matter, but because every other invasive species case study tells the same story. The cost and difficulty of control rises sharply for every year a population is left to breed undisturbed. The Everglades python population spent roughly 2 to 3 decades expanding largely under the radar before it became the organized, well-funded, technology-driven removal effort it is today. That head start is precisely why, even with drones, certified hunting teams, radio-tagged Judas snakes, and statewide competitions, full eradication is no longer considered a realistic goal by most researchers studying the system. The new, more honest goal is suppression, keeping the population low enough that native species have a chance to recover in at least some areas, rather than eliminating the threat outright. The footage didn't create the crisis. It simply made visible something that's been happening quietly under the surface of America's most famous swamp for years, and for anyone watching it for the first time, the aftermath captured on camera is exactly as unsettling as it looks.